Hey, live now. That's a good sign. Hey, everybody. Welcome into 50 Toast. Sorry we're a little late. We had some technical issues. Seems to be the nature of this sort of stuff. Uh, I am excited. I'm excited. I would have had Bryan Miller anyway, just to talk about life and comedy. He's one of the most funny and insightful, interesting people I know. But and of course, he's a gigantic contributor to Quick Snaps podcast and all things Quick Snaps. But none of that's relevant now because there's a more important thing happening. You are on the front lines. You have a first row view. You're at ground zero of the global story happening. Bryan Miller lives in Minneapolis, owns a home kind of near downtown. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, in South Minneapolis, right here.
You're
where
right
it's happening.
And you and I talked on the phone a couple days ago, and I had so many questions, and it was hard for me to just not ask them all and wait and save it for this because I think I'm not the only one who has a lot of questions for you. Let's get to all that in 1 second. A couple of quick notes. This is 50 Toast. We're going to be doing this in this space, 9 p.m., Facebook Live, every Thursday for the foreseeable future. It's a chance for me to hook up with 50 friends over the course of a year. It's the new quarantine version of 50 lunches, which I've done before. And in this space on Wednesdays is Fantasy Throwback, the opposite, just a goofy, silly, nothing serious to talk about fantasy game show. Check out Patreon, type in Costaki and you'll be off and running on that stuff. Bryan has an Acme show. Acme's coming back. We'll talk about this more later on, but just a quick plug. Acme is doing some live shows from the stage with the microphone and the thing and online. And the very first couple feature Bryan Miller, very funny, great comic. Coming up on the 12th and 13th. All right, this thing is called 50 Toast, so let's start with the toast, and then I'm going to sit back and listen for a while.
Sure.
I found this one about an hour ago. Here's to staying positive and testing negative. It seems like it has way more meaning now than probably when it was written, but there you go. Cheers, everybody.
Yeah, indeed.
All right, friend. Tell me what's going on. Give me the whole timeline. I want to hear everything.
Yeah, well, okay. So George Floyd is killed on a Monday. I think everyone knows that at this point, I hope. I don't know how you could not. That was so I live it was probably 2.5 miles-ish from me, just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm located to the geography of the whole event, kind of over the interstate in South Minneapolis, place I know well, very regular neighborhood, right in front of a very prominent grocery store. So of course these cops kill him. There's really no two ways about that.
Yeah.
I kind of don't like, people try to tiptoe around the niceties of, well, the incident occurred. I was like, well, it wasn't an incident,
Yeah, right.
An incident is when I think I see somebody hanging out by my garage playing with the keypad at night. That's an incident.
Right.
So the murder was on Monday, and the protests began here, of course, right away. I mean, the video, I'm sure you've seen it. It's really the most horrible video I think I've ever seen of that kind, which is saying something.
Yeah, that's right. It's definitely the most. It might be the least debatable video. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, and it's like not something I like to. It's not like I have a ranking system. It's not a comparison thing, but like just like, man, that's like it reminded me of the Rodney King video.
Right.
And very different, but I mean, just in terms of just like the impact that it had, for people who saw that, like I'm old enough to remember seeing it like when it was new and it was like, oh, holy smokes.
Right. Right.
So the protest started right away. Very steady. The precinct house near where the cops came out of in South Minneapolis became kind of the focus of the protest. So I think it was Wednesday night was when the huge protests and the police just didn't really have much of a presence. And that's when sort of some of the looting started, along with the protests, sort of really late at night. Stuff would, and then the thing is that I don't want to sound too conspiratorial here, but the police just conspicuously had absolutely no protest or no presence of any kind for 2 days, almost as though, even though there were most of the people were totally peaceful and, hey, maybe you should go stop the guy starting the fire and leave the guy doing the chant, right? but they don't do any of that. One could almost argue in such a way as to let things get so out of control as to feel like their presence is justified. And so that's when they really crack down 3 nights later on Saturday. In between the two times, they don't show up for anything, and people start setting fires. And that's when you see the big housing project that burned down. That was on a Thursday. That's when
Right.
the mayor abandoned the police station, and apparently he made the decision to abandon that police station strategically sometime before. And I don't think he could have possibly done it in a worse way, because I think it would have been interesting to say, like, you know what, we are going to vacate this space. Um, I don't know, out of respect. He could have like made a moment of like saying like, we're going to leave this space and let you protest here and, you know, whatever. But instead, you know, the cops flee under cover of dark in a caravan of cars, like a retreating army, and they're literally spraying pepper spray and throwing tear gas canisters behind them as they go at the protesters. So it's just like, it's the worst possible version of everything, right?
Right.
And
Right.
then the mayor comes on and says, by the way, just because, you know, the police station has been abandoned, don't think that services aren't going to be provided to that neighborhood. Well, no services get provided for 2 days. The firemen won't go in because the cops won't go in, and the cops won't go in. Question mark? Why? I mean, nobody has any great answers for it. And it's not like I don't want the police to stop the protesting, but maybe stop the fires.
Yeah.
So the thing that I think is, I think overall nationally, the riots are much overreported, and the protests are underreported. You
Right.
know, the riots are flashier; they're easier to put on TV.
Sure.
And in Minneapolis, there was much more protesting than rioting. The rioting was much, to say, smaller, to say the least. But I think what happened was people saw that the police just literally weren't doing anything. They weren't stopping anybody from doing anything of any kind. And a lot of different elements from a lot of different places said, this is our chance, be it to egg on further violence, to cause random chaos, or to rob. I'm friends of a not a liquor store, a jewelry store owner. His jewelry store got completely ransacked. It was nowhere near where everything was going on, but during that time, SUV pulls up, 4 guys with machine guns get out, shoot the door, kick the thing open, go rob it, come back. I mean, you're probably looking at just your basic robbery / maybe gang robbery. You know, I don't
Right.
know who they were with, but maybe they were. I don't know who they were, but this wasn't part of the protest that got out of hand. I mean, these are guys who just like, oh, the cops aren't doing anything, let's go.
Right. So it's total
And
opportunism based on there's
yes,
no cops available to stop us tonight. We can do whatever we want.
100%, and for 2 nights. So you had this overlap of
Yeah.
opportunists, of people who were protesting, and maybe even some, you know, tearing up a mailbox or doing, you know, but in protest, overlapping with people who were then just protesting completely peacefully, who were the vast majority. So, you
Right.
know, in all this blend, these elements skin in. I mean, they've got videos of like these like white supremacist dudes, or certainly very conspicuous white dudes in masks who are setting fires and running away and not joining any kind of protests. And it's like,
Right.
who, you know, there's so many people with mysterious motives, you know, going around at this point surrounding this whole thing, which has been totally out of control. So, um, my neighborhood gets kind of caught up in it on Friday. That's when, if you saw when the bank and the post office got burned, that was, I mean, that was down the block from me. You know, we've eaten at that restaurant. Remember, we went to that sports bar when you were in town for like
Yeah.
like a layover for a flight. So like next big street over, right where my house was, it was just like 10 blocks down that way, 8 blocks down that way. You know, so you've been around that that part of town, to say the least.
Oof. So how
And
does
Meg and
that?
I are,
That's one of my questions for you. How does that make you feel as a homeowner, as a guy who lives right? I mean, what's happening in you when that's going on?
I mean, it was already strange. Like the night before, you could see the sky glowing red, from the big fires, a little bit farther to the west or east, and you hear the choppers going overhead, and you know, it was crazy just knowing that was going on in your city and seeing how mishandled it was being, and right away, my wife and I were saying, like, one, we're worried about, no police protest also means that if someone starts attacking protesters, there's no one to protect them either, right?
Sure.
Someone
Right.
drives a van into a crowd or some crazy thing.
Right.
So we're like worried about the
Semi
protesters, and
truck.
then
Yeah.
yes, right. So we're worried about them, and we're also saying, like, man, the thing we just know, we're like, the longer they do nothing, the more things swell. The crackdown is going to come, and like, how bad's that going to be? And it was just a mess, you know. So
Right.
it's not even abstract, because I'd gone to those protests that day. But it's also different when, so then the next night when we start hearing some noises, like, what is all this noise going on down the block? And we turn the news on, and then we see the kind of melee start, and it was crazy. So we were watching live on TV when the first guy threw the first firebomb into the Wells Fargo, which is the bank that I go to, and
Wow.
it was crazy. Then, like, when the cars were on fire, the cars would blow up, and you'd see the car blow up on TV, and then you would hear it from your TV, but you would also hear it right behind you when it was down the street. And so you're
Wow.
hearing this riot in surround sound. And that night was just when there was a guy walking down the street, a white guy, I should point out, walking down the street with a medieval axe, just walking around with this giant axe, and you saw him chop his way into this one building. And I mean, it was nuts. And at one point, my wife and I are just on the couch watching this, listening, going outside, just back and forth. And the news anchor goes, "If I lived in that neighborhood right now, I would be terrified."
Yeah, right.
And we just started laughing so hard because it was just so hilariously absurd to have, like, essentially the Arrested Development narrator pop in and be like, "In fact, the house was near the riots." And you're like, "Thanks, narrator, for keeping us posted on what's going on." It's very strange. I honestly, I never really worried about our physical safety or our house, even though we were fairly close to it, just because nothing about these protests or even the riots part of it, which was, again, it was a big riot, but a small part of the protest, if that makes sense. None had gone to residential neighborhoods really until that night. And that was the first night that they did a little bit, but it was mostly tertiary. And what happened was they wanted to start blocking the police away, so they started barricading the streets with dumpsters and trash cans and lighting those on fire so you couldn't get through. But every single street around that bank and everything, as soon as you go south, it's all residential. It's a little bit mixed use, of laundromats and a restaurant here and there, a coffee shop, but it's you've been here, you've seen my house. It's very residential.
Yeah, for sure.
And
Yeah, right.
if you didn't know you were in Minneapolis and you woke up in my house and looked out, you could be in any college town and any, like, main, off the main street kind of thing, just
Right,
residential
right.
housing, And so then when I saw the fires getting close to those houses and the trees that are all hanging over the streets, I was just worried, not that someone was going to try to start a fire, or on a house, but, like, man, you start getting those trees catching around those houses and they're all packed in close together. I was worried
Right.
for some people's safety. And there's apartment buildings. There's some, like, elderly people and kind of like handicap accessible apartment buildings right near some of the stuff that was getting burned. I was worried about them. You definitely had there's a place called the Midtown Global Market, which is at Chicago and 28th nearabouts. Giant old, like, Sears building or something. Bottom floors of DMV. No worries there. I mean, they've probably already been firebombed 5 times, but next floor is this giant small business incubator called the Midtown Global Market, which is a lot of, like, immigrant-owned businesses and restaurants sort of get their start there, and then if they're successful enough, they move on to brick and mortar or food truck, and industrial kitchens and really cool stuff. And then above that, it's a lot of housing, and I think it's a lot of low-income housing. And there's definitely at least some Section 8 for, like, elderly and handicapped people, because you saw those people sitting in their lobby looking out, and a guy who didn't seem to be affiliated with any political protest of any kind was trying to set it on fire, and the cops didn't do anything. The only reason that building didn't burn was the neighbors came out and formed, like, a group, and they patrolled the building the whole night and put out fires and stopped people from setting fires
Wow.
to the building because they knew people lived in there. And all the kind of more when the kind of really call them like rough, more violent protests were going on, nobody touched any houses. Any people were spray painting. People live here with arrows up to their, like, if they live in, like, a second floor apartment, above a restaurant. And as much as it seems crazy and chaotic, and it was, I went through that neighborhood and looked around. There's no vandalism of any houses. There was no places like Torch that had that going on or whatever. There was only a few incidences of people trying, and none of those people seemed affiliated in any capacity, if you know what I mean. I don't know who they are. I'm not going to speculate, but they seemed highly unaffiliated.
Right. Well, that's one of the things I want to ask you about, because Am I right? The governor made a statement that they're having like a big percentage of the problems are coming from out of state, and they even passed or made it clear that they're going to enforce a law that was made a federal crime to cross state lines to do some crazy shit. Fill me in on
Oh,
some
I don't
of
know.
that.
I haven't heard about that part. They started that all the people are coming from out of state narrative early on, and honestly, it's partly true, but it's also really not true. The way I know it's partly true, this is anecdotal, but I stake my life on it. I was going to the protests on Thursday, and it's down Lake Street, which is a very major street. It's the next major street from my house going the real big one going north. And Lake Street is where the precinct was, and most of the fires were on Lake Street. This was before most of the fires, after the first really heavy night of protests, small looting. And parallel to Lake Street is 31st, runs completely parallel all the way down South Minneapolis. There's
Right.
2 miles of Lake Street completely blocked off, like just traffic jam, right? Everyone wants to go, no one can get there. It's like a line for a concert 2 hours beforehand. I went over to 31st, not a car on the road. I zipped right down there. Locals know to go on 31st. Locals know 31st runs all the way parallel.
Huh.
But unless you're not using Waze or something, if you're from out of town, you just go to the Lake Street and go that way because you don't know that 31st cuts the same way. And so I
Wow.
remember thinking, I know these people aren't from here because all the local, like I did see a handful of locals obviously on 31st, but it was like, that's how that's how people knew.
Wow.
That's how I felt like I knew. It was like, oh, this is definitely an out of town thing. If nobody knows to go this way. Um,
But out of
but
town, like Mankato, like where are they coming from?
that's absolutely, yeah. It could be anywhere from suburbs to, I mean, there were definitely people from out of state. I talked to somebody who said they were I talked to a journalist who flew in from New York and said almost everyone in his plane was flying in from New York to protest. This is before the protesting had sort of spread to other cities
Yeah.
as much. So it was like this was kind of the one. There was a time where all the protests were really concentrated in Minneapolis. So we became like the hub of those protests before the expansion kind of went out.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Um, and then so you have a lot of totally legitimate protesters coming here, a lot of news media coming here, all at the same time that the cops are doing literally nothing. So then you get these agitators going, this is a situation I could take advantage of.
Right.
I was telling somebody, people kind of forget that like crazy white supremacists have been trying to start a race war for 50, 60 years minimum.
Sure.
I mean, that's what Charles Manson was trying to do when he wrote Piggy on the Walls in Blood, right?
Right.
People forget that was even the Manson murders were
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that all the way back then. So it's not surprising to me that there's some dudes who want that to happen for whom, throwing a couple of Molotov cocktails, just agitating, just doing their best to stir stuff up, make things more violent, more hectic, more crazy, more out of control seeming. You had a lot of threatening notes left to people at Black Lives Matter signs saying like, we're going to come burn down your house. A lot of people on Twitter reporting things that I think these accounts were bots, because there really were like cars with no license plates found in my neighborhood, and then they'd be full of gas cans where clearly somebody had planned something and had to leave or got arrested or
Yeah. I
whatever.
want to hear about
And
that. So
yeah,
yeah,
somebody torched a car down the street too. So like there legitimately were for sure those people around here involved doing stuff. But I personally think there's also a sort of coordinated terrorism is about striking fear, and this is a very online movement. So I think there's the real thing, and then I think there's a lot of intentional false reporting from bad actors, just trying to make everybody more on edge, thinking it's more pervasive even than it is. You
right.
know?
Wow. So that's one of the things I want to ask you about. So you mentioned accelerants in the bushes, and this I hadn't heard. There's questionable cars filled with gasoline in the neighborhood. Like, tell me about that.
Yeah. When I first saw that on Twitter, I mean, after the last 6 months, I'm kind of out of the disbelief business. When stuff happens, you just go, yeah, I guess that happens now. Like, like I feel like if you're shocked, I'm shocked anymore, right? But
Yeah.
when I first saw that, I thought this has all the makings of like kind of urban legendy, panicky moment. After 9/11, for like 2 months, everybody. There's always a report. I heard that somebody saw an Arab-looking guy videotaping the post office.
Right.
He was bird watching or something like or whatever. It was a guy from India bird watching, and you turned this into this. But I thought it was paranoia or whatever, and then they started talking about it on the news, and then I saw some photos of from verified accounts that they did find some of that. I don't think it was a ton, and I don't think it was with the intention. There's no way for me to know this, but most of the ones, it seemed to me that they were probably like, I'll hide this here, I'll come back, I'll get it, I'll throw it into a business, I'll throw it into a car. I don't know that the plan was like to attack the 35 block of some sleepy residential town and burn down a
Right.
bunch of single family homes and duplexes.
Right.
But
But
obviously, the fact that it was here, those people are around,
yeah, it's
and you
kind of
never,
terrifying. Is it water bottles filled with gas? It's like baskets full of
jars. It was like
wood.
jars full of gasoline and like acetylene turpentine type stuff. Yeah, basically stuff for homemade Molotov cocktails. And gas
Wow.
cans. There was a car. I think this was just yesterday. So I live on Pillsbury near 44th, and this was near 34th, about 10 blocks north. Somebody burned a car, but like the car had no plates. And the burning of the car, I would imagine, like you're trying to get rid of, fingerprints or whatever. I don't know. But somebody burned a car probably that they had stolen for use in some nefarious activities, because they responded to this just burning car in the middle of a residential street, totally peaceful around it with the car, no plates or identification.
Right. Now, does it happen like in the movies when a car is burning and then the fire eventually gets to the gas tank and there's a gigantic fireball explosion? Is that what happens?
You've never seen a car fire, really? I've seen a weird number of car
I've never
fires in
seen
my
a car
day.
explosion. I've seen a fire that's happening as I drive by, but I've never seen it explode.
I mean, kind of, but not like the car doesn't. Usually, the frame doesn't lift off the ground, and then wheels don't go flying off in interesting directions, and no one's smoking and walking away from it. At the same time, there's some differences. But yeah, I
There's
mean, it's
no
a big
little
like
quip
it makes a
about
whomp. Like I could hear when a car would like blow up by the bank when they were burning some cars there. There was a particular sound that the car would make. It was made like thump. You could kind of hear it go.
wow.
Like because they just burn so hot. One of the only things I saw that happened to somebody's house, and you feel really bad for these people. The precinct house is also in a pretty the one that was over the original one. Was pretty near, and this housing project or housing development was near a few houses, and the heat from one of those fires just melted the siding off the side of someone's house, which I'd never seen before. It was just like bare wood and just this pile of like molten siding.
Oof.
I'd never seen that.
Wow. All right, I have several questions. So
Sure.
the first couple nights, is it fair to hold the powers that be accountable for not having their shit together, or was it kind of a surprise that this was going to be a huge cultural event? We didn't know that yet, or it was happening pretty much right away and it should have been clear to everybody?
I mean, I don't think you can maybe entirely blame them for underappreciating the scale, but the response was so far removed from okay.
Right.
And it's hard to say how much of it was malice and how much of it was incompetence. I can't say for sure, but
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing that's conspicuous. So Lake Street is a heavily kind of immigrant business owned area. A lot of Mexican restaurants. There's a kind of big kind of Latinx area there, but especially a Mexican neighborhood. And you have all kinds of different immigrant restaurants up and down Lake Street in general. And then Lake Street blends into Uptown, which used to be kind of the punk rock area, and of late, of the last 20 years, has become like gentrified with like your the Apple store and all the fancy clothing stores and the chains, and they still have some cool stuff, but it's definitely like gentrified, expensive, flashy, whatever.
Right.
So there's fires going all the way down Lake Street, and Lake Street goes from Midtown and then into Uptown. Well, the cops they had no police presence at Midtown. So when the protests did move into Midtown, there was nobody to dissuade the firebugs from setting the fires. There was just literally nobody there. Even though that was between the two precincts. Clearly the movement's going to go between these two through Midtown. No, they went ahead and had heavy police presence in case anybody came into Uptown. So there was
Right.
tons of cops standing in front of the chain stores like, don't you better come down here. So they can
Right.
tell you they didn't have enough force to deter the rioters, but they seem to have enough force to deter the rioters if they came to Uptown.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So why did Midtown have to burn? That's what doesn't make sense to me. And the fact that there weren't any police protecting like Midtown Global Market, and there was no police presence in front of the apartment complex for like the elderly people. Like, you're telling me you can't spare 4 cops to stand out in front of the building full of elderly people and try to run off
Right.
firebugs?
Yeah. Right.
I don't buy it. So
Yeah.
that's what suggests to me that there's some, if it's lack of planning, it's really spectacular lack of planning. But if the plan was to do nothing to make people regret, they'll appreciate us when, right, ... and then let it get so bad, so then when you want to crack down and they send 350 National Guardsmen marching down Nicollet Avenue, shooting tear gas into completely peaceful protests that they can
Yeah.
pretend to be justified.
Yeah. Wow. And another thing that strikes me as odd is the decision to concede the police department to a fire. Like,
That was weird.
is there something in there that I'm misreading? Maybe there's
I understand why you think there is.
I mean, I don't, it just
No, I
seems
know. That was
like, if
when
I'm a
we were
cop, I'm like, they're not burning down the fucking police department. We're gonna keep that from happening.
Dude, I felt that way about my neighborhood, and I didn't even think anybody was coming to my neighborhood. But like, some people left for the weekend, and some people called me and said, you really should probably maybe go stay in a hotel or stay with some friends. And I was like, no. I mean, I know it sounds dumb, but like, I was kind of stubborn. I was raised in the South. I can be kind of dumb. I was like, no, what's running me off my property? You fucking
Right,
kidding
right,
me?
yeah, right.
Like that's how I felt about it. Just
Yeah.
about that. And and like I said, I didn't think protesters were coming for my house anyway. But in fact, there was an amazing story. So 2 nights of no police response whatsoever. Third night, when they did, then they had the crackdown. The protests kind of scatter every which way. The problem was that the rioters were using the protests as a, you use the confusion of that to spread your trouble around the edges of that.
Sure.
So the people were worried about having the protests in like residential areas, because like, well, what if that then sparks off the trouble in the residential areas where there's nothing but family houses and apartments? Yeah. So there's live video of the protests marching down the street, and the local news people actually did an incredible job following the protests and covering them like sensibly as opposed to sensationally for the most part. Just the local people. The national news has been terrible. It's been like live PD, but the local news was following these guys, and you see the protests marching, and then you just see like 20 Native American dudes with a baseball bat over in the Little Earth community, which is the Native community on the way east, and the natives are just like, nope, you're not coming in. But they also didn't bust heads or anything. They were like, hey, we support you, we totally understand. You could see them like talking to the protesters, but they were like, but if anything's getting broken up, it's not going to be our restaurants and coffee shops in our community. You're going to need to find another direction.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. That was it was both a conflict and but not a conflict, which was interesting. But kind of, I don't know. I don't know. If you know anything about American history, you can't not, even if I'm on the side of the protesters, but like, you see those Native dudes standing there protecting their, like, get out. And you're like, yeah. You got to root for those guys. Come on.
Of course. All right. Now, you had some strong opinions about the mayor and the governor. Educate me a little bit on that, because I've followed a little bit, but I don't know much.
I just don't think the mayor's very good. I've never liked the way he governs. I think he's a big he's a big press release guy. He's a guy with a lot of political ambitions who wants to do a lot of showy stuff, and he says the right things a lot of times, which I do appreciate. I always tell people, if they've seen The Wire, he's totally Tommy Carcetti from The Wire. Like, just through and through Tommy Carcetti. I called him Carcetti to his face one time. I don't know if you understood what I was saying, but because we got into it when he was a councilman. He was involved in the whole Acme parking lot thing.
Oh.
And so Jacob Fry is the kind of guy, before all this, in addition to his other problems, his sort of utopian dream for the city is that he's going to make all the parking really expensive and inaccessible, and then people will be so desperate to get downtown that they'll finally start demanding public transit, and then they'll build public transit. Okay, what does that do for poor and middle class people during that 10-year period?
Yeah.
The rich people can afford to pay the escalating parking fees and go through all the trouble, but it gets harder and harder and harder on poor people and middle class people. But you're not already building the transportation infrastructure to get them to the downtown area that you need. Like, it's like, so that's his thing. Is like, it's like this sort of like, if you dream it, it will come. And it's like, build the transportation, then start limiting the park. You're doing it backwards, you asshole. You got to give people a way to get downtown. but he doesn't think about these kinds of things. And his, there's definitely some upper crusty liberal cohort types around here, like the Dayton brothers, who, these guys, they open a clothing store. Their dad's the governor at the time, Mark Dayton, and like, oh, I can't believe our store's doing so good. And like they sell winter hats in Minnesota, and they think they're fucking geniuses. I mean, these guys are just total jokers. And so them and Frey are all a bunch of useless assholes anyway. And so I honestly think that Frey thought that, like, the symbolic abandoning the police station will show that I'm on their side. And
that's what I wondered. You're conceding a big symbolic victory to the other side. Was that a strategic choice?
Possibly / possibly. I mean, it seemed to be to some degree. Certainly you could choose different ways to do it, and that's the way they chose to do it. They certainly could have, I don't know, charged the could have charged the other 3 officers. Like, there were other things they could have done the whole time.
That's one of the great mysteries of this whole
They're already we all know they're gonna do it, right? We all know it's gonna have to happen. You idiots, do it now. Don't wait 4 days.
Right. It's so crazy. And it's the same lesson that we've had always about all of these things. Like, if you had killed this guy quietly with no video, there'd be a couple of newspaper articles, and that would be it. Yeah. But it's the video that everyone is seeing over and over again that so viscerally hurts your feelings that you have to do something about it. And it's the same thing we've had with all of this stuff. It's like,
and it's definitely the repetition. I mean, this was, it's like, this was such a stark, terrible version of a thing that has happened so many times. And here, Jamar Clark was killed here on the north side in a very, very, very questionable police shooting. Philando Castile was killed. There was that video of him being shot in the Twin Cities, just north in the burbs, same area, totally the same area. He was a legal gun owner who tells the cop after he got pulled over for a traffic violation, hey, by the way, officer, I just want you to know, no, just want you to know, I'm a legal license carry holder. I have a weapon on me right now. And then the guy just shoots him. And of course, then the NRA says nothing because they don't actually care about gun rights. They care about certain people's gun rights, but they don't care about gun rights. Because what more threat is there to gun rights than if a cop finds out you legally have a gun, he will shoot you? I really can't think, like, but they're protesting to being able to bring an AK into a Target while you shop for Pampers or whatever. Like, the priorities are a little backwards here, guys. So this has happened a lot in Minneapolis. And then just so much in the last, I mean, it's been happening obviously for a long time, but with the proliferation of cameras and cell phone videos, so many of these videos, so little has been done, so I think it was all that pressure. It was just all that pressure. And then this especially horrible video where the cops seem to almost look in the camera like, he's like, I know what I'm doing and I don't care that you're videotaping me. It was almost like, at least the Rodney King guys didn't know they were on camera. Like, it's not, it doesn't make the behavior better, but in a way you're like, well, at least they, like, this video almost shows that, like, not only might the cops kill you, they don't care who knows. They don't feel accountable in any way, like the implications of some of that were really heavy, and then the city's slow response, which is like, I mean, if my wife was found strangled and there was video of me leaning on her neck, they wouldn't wait 5 days to charge me. Right. They would charge me, like, it was no reason not to, to charge this guy. Charge him. He still gets a trial. We didn't convict him on the first day.
Yeah, right.
They just weren't charged on the first day. And then by dragging their feet on that, I think that was just.
And to me, this is the whole argument of, like, the whole world had pressure on you to do this, and you finally did it. What happens when the whole world isn't watching? What are they? Right. They're not doing the right thing,
Oh, and I mean, so many crazy things are involved in the story. So many layers. You forget. Like, so first off, when the cops released the initial press release the night on Tuesday morning after they killed him on Memorial Day, they claim that he lived for an hour. Like, basically, the report suggests he lived for an hour and then suffered a medical episode at the hospital. Like, they totally downplayed what you could see with your own eyes. You could see the breath go out of his body on the video, which they knew was out there. And then when they had the autopsy report released a few days after that, the autopsy report says, like, well, Yeah, I mean, he had underlying health conditions,
Right.
and then they even speculated that he had intoxicants in his system without naming what intoxicants were in his system. How are you going to speculate? You
That's
can't
your
say
job, is to measure the intoxicants and report the truth.
yes. And the tox report, I guess, wasn't back yet. So, so it's like, and regardless, by the way, it's like I think you're allowed to have 4 beers and a bum heart and not get your neck stood on for 8 minutes. I mean, it's like
That's a
the
good
cops aren't
policy.
supposed to assume that no one has any health conditions.
You should run for mayor on that slogan. That's nice.
Yeah, right. So I mean, the city's response was so bad at every level. It was just
Yeah.
so bad, consistently. And so I mean, I think that's what really built the momentum of the protest. And then they took their own momentum, and then it took a global momentum, or then a national, then a global momentum, and that is still swelling. And what's crazy, in a way now, is that Minneapolis is much calmer than the rest of America in a lot of
Yes.
ways.
That's another thing that surprised me about all this. Yeah, right. It's
Yeah,
one of the
we don't have
nicest
any
places.
riots. Oh no, but I mean like right now. I mean today, it is much calmer here than in many American cities.
Oh, that's
We don't have
interesting.
any rioting going on of any kind right now. We have a ton of peaceful protest. We have a ton of people speaking out. We have a ton of activity. We have volunteer food shelves. I mean, a lot of things are happening. People are pushing for reform. I mean, so much is happening, but it's not the negative stuff. I mean, all you see is people coming together and people peacefully protesting in large groups at different places all over the town. Um, and so that's what's it's weird now. It's like we had the worst by far of the rioting and the fires
Of
in
course.
those
Right.
in those earliest couple of days. But now that it's spread, it's like we've already kind of moved past that phase of it into like a whole different phase,
Right.
and then it's still kind of burning hot elsewhere. Not as
It's
a
very
movement, but I mean as a kind of as the initial swell of it.
right. Hold that thought. I think I didn't plug in something. It's going to be 10 seconds. Just 1 second. Yes, I mean that to me that's one of the funny things about this. Again, all this is relative, but as a comic who travels around for a living, like you're jarringly aware of how nice Minneapolis is broadly as a city when you come from somewhere else. And another thing you don't notice very much is people of color. Like you don't see them much. They're not a you
Because
don't
it's sort of segregated is why. I
right.
mean,
I get that now, but and you hear Tom Bernard talk about growing up with black friends, and he's got black buddies, but I always think of like the Chris Rock joke of like, there's no black people in Minneapolis. There's Prince and Kirby Puckett.
yeah,
Like I know a couple of black comics, but when you work Acme for the week, you don't see a lot of people of color. It's mostly like nice white people milling around.
well, because and
Uh,
that's the North Loop, which is actually interesting and near the neighborhood that's like predominantly black, the North Side. It's just right across the highway there, right down Broadway.
right.
But yeah, no, Minneapolis is a pretty segregated city. And no, it also is, it is not the most diverse city either. Um,
Right. Of
it
course.
is
Well,
still it's not as white as people think it is, but it's still pretty white. But then
yeah. Right.
segregated, and on top of it, I think it's a very progressive place overall. And I do think like your average neighbor around here is a nice, good, helpful person. But there are definitely some not great people for sure. And the cops here are just notoriously bad. If you're a black person in Minneapolis, you have had run-ins with the cops. In fact, I remember one night at Acme, we were a bunch of comics were just sitting around talking about this. It was probably after Philando Castile, if I had to guess. It could have been after Jamar Clark, but we were just talking about it, and we just started going around naming how many times we'd all been pulled over by the cops. And I think my
Right.
number was, I think 3. I think like 3 was my number for any reason. And when it would get to Greg or Nick the bartender, drummer Nick,
Right.
he was like, I've been pulled over 17 times coming home from Acme, and then like one of the white managers was like, I've been pulled over twice coming home from Acme. So it's like the same for people leaving the same club at the same time, and you get one guy getting pulled over 15 times and one person getting pulled over
I
twice.
feel like this is I feel like this is the biggest lesson for white folks from this conversation is that black people are having a totally different experience, and white people aren't aware that that's happening. Like I reposted a thing from a comic who yeah, this series of, and then I was following, I followed some white girls that I was with through a couple of trains, and I got arrested that night. And I did this one thing, and they held me down on the ground in the oil slick, and I asked them to let me go on the sidewalk, and they didn't. And he had so many of these kind of beats that he said, I have 40 or 50 of these kind of stories. And I went home and cried, and they made me feel small. And I can't believe I just swallowed my pride. I didn't do anything. And his point was that, some white friends have been saying to him, like, they saw the video and they understand how this sparked the fire. He's like, no, this was just the match. Like, all of the gas has been building for all of this time. And that's something that I don't have any friends who have 40 or 50 cops fucked me over stories. I don't know anybody who has that, that.
Do you though? You might.
No. I'm saying of sort of my go-to sort of white.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Tom Simmons isn't getting
right,
hauled over by the side of the. Yeah,
so
of course. Yeah.
I think that's part of the gap that's happening in this conversation. That when white people hear these, they don't sound real because that's not happening to them or the people they know. And that's something that I think we've got to get better at understanding. And there's a dramatic difference in the way that we're experiencing the world, and especially the way that we interact with, authority. And so, and I think about my own sort of crazy youth, and a couple of times I was dealing with cops, and I never was afraid that I was going to be killed. It never even occurred to me. I don't see authority that way.
And you only need to have one or two of those youthful, like, kind of, little reckless, slightly lawless indiscretions. The difference between, get out of here, little scamp, and
right.
we're going to throw you into booking and you're 17, so now you're not going to graduate or whatever. And then the next time you get pulled over, they say, well, it looks like 2 years ago you got pulled over, and then the way that just mounts, right. Like, you keep pulling people over, you keep finding things. And so that's why it always bugs me when you see, like, well, I mean, they shot him, but he had, he'd been charged 7 different times over his life.
Yeah, right.
Like, but A, it doesn't matter. But also B, what are those charges? And I don't know that was like, it wasn't 7 times he ran into a nursing home with an axe swinging around. It was 7 times he was walking down the street.
And I like the other day I went riding my bike around downtown just to kind of get a feel of what's going on and see some protests and pitch in a little bit and kind of to keep my distance and see where the cops were and see what the interaction was. And I mean, just that is a white privilege, to be able to ride around on a bicycle with no fear of anything. I realized that if I was a black guy, I would be a lot more wary of doing what I did. And I think back to one time when I was 19, we got pulled over on New Year's Eve. We had a sober driver, and the other 4 of us in the car were hammered. And they gave us all tickets for underage drinking. And I was screaming in the cop's face that they were doing it wrong. They shouldn't have been bothering us, that we made a good decision. And that part of a law is how it's enforced, and you guys are making a terrible, you're giving us negative reading. I was furious, and I didn't worry about being killed or thrown in jail. I was a drunk white kid. I realized in retrospect, that was a lot of white privilege. So yeah, I think you said it well. Those little beats that are different for the other side of this conversation, they add up and they pile up and they get in your guts, and they make you feel small, and they can hurt your record. And these little things that happen your whole life, every day, all the time. I remember when I was looking for a job in England, I went there to work one summer when I was in college. And a couple of times when I went in for interviews, I went in to ask about the job, I said my name, and I got this sort of like dismissive sort of attitude about Greeks, which I'd never heard of before. Like I just lucked into a culture that everybody loves in America. Everyone has a Greek friend.
Yeah, that's true. In America, it's like, hey,
Greek, that's great. And in England at the time, there was a little bit of like an onslaught of unskilled workers who were coming to town. So Greeks were a little bit like the Mexicans of that situation.
Interesting.
And so I got negative, sort of poisonous, yucky response to my culture for the first time in my life. And it was tiny. It wasn't even a big deal. And it hurt my feelings. And I was like, I don't like this at all. This is not
sure.
at all. So imagine a lifetime of that. A lifetime of going into the store and they follow you around to make sure you don't steal something. And the weight of the way the cops treat you, and the job that doesn't quite come through, and the, you know, the resume that doesn't get read, and on and on and on. It builds up your whole existence. Yeah, I get why you're pissed. I get I get why
Totally.
I see why a police station burns down at some point. It's like you watch that video and you go, holy fuck, it's crazy.
Yeah, and then that anybody could watch that video and not have some sort of strong response. You know, that the police union chief of Minneapolis could watch that and be like, "Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that." Like that, obviously there's nothing worse than the thing itself, but there's something so cold about the reaction where it's like so calculating, and you know, he's like, "Really, really, you can watch that and not as a human person just go, well, that's obviously wrong."
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
yeah, obviously
yeah,
you should ever do
of course.
that. It's
All right,
crazy.
let me make sure I didn't miss any questions for you. I scribbled down some stuff over here. Oh, I want you educated me on something a couple days ago that I didn't know about. The defund the police. I kind
Oh
of
yeah.
I sneered at that briefly. Give us a brief description of that. I looked it up actually today, so I want to hear you describe this again.
Yeah, and I'm not the best person to describe this, although they are literally actively looking into that right now in Minneapolis. Lisa Bender, one of the Minneapolis council people, just said, we are going to disband the police and reform them in a substantially different way. She tweeted that out tonight, which is significant.
Now I will listen to that. That doesn't sound at first blush to me like the right way to do this, but hey, this is an emergency situation. I'll listen to everything.
So the kind of, as best I can understand, I think she was kind of getting at the defund sort of thing, but the idea of defunding the police is that it's not to take away all funding, so there are literally no police officers. Like I said, if some nut job starts shooting up a shopping mall, which, like I said, this is America, happens pretty often. You know, you need people to respond to that. But there are so many things that happen. It could be domestic violence, even like sexual assault, much like homelessness, any kind of addiction, overdose issue, mental illness, where the thought is that there are people who would be better to respond to that, like well-trained. This isn't just like, you know, helpful Debbie from down the street, like professionally trained city employees who are made up of, you know, like social workers and experts in those fields, and that they would go out and they would be the first responders to some of these incidents. Because, you know, a lot of these crimes have already happened in a lot of cases, or you have a person overdosed, or you know, any kind of drug situation, any kind of, you know, mentally ill person sort of, you know, ranting in a downtown and needs to be taken away. Like the police are kind of the military, become so militarized, you know, they're the hammer.
Right.
And the idea is that, like, the hammer is not the right tool for all these little jobs.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
so you take away a lot of the funding for the police and you put it into these responders. And you even, you know, you think about stuff like, you know, sexual assault. So then instead of having a cop, you know, you have a trained kind of medical expert and a sociologist trained in that, somebody's like asking you the questions and doing the things, knowing kind of psychologically how to deal with it, but also,
Yeah.
you know, you hear stories of women reporting sexual assaults to cops, and a lot of times those stories are pretty horrible. Like the story of them reporting it is horrifying. You hear
Right.
about all the kits, they do the rape kits that just sit and nobody looks into them. These things don't get investigated. You know, so I think it would be, if you had people who were taking that was their only job, that was super serious about that, they were dedicated to that. I can't imagine they would let that founder, they would treat that very immediately.
Right.
You know, so there's just all these, you know, like I said, when someone's mentally ill, like, well, throwing them in jail isn't going to solve any problems. They're mentally ill. They need something else, or someone needs a treatment program. And so it's kind of about not just treating general kind of crime and punishment, just rethinking crime and punishment in America, basically.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
love that. When I first I saw some of the signs when I was wandering around, you know, defund the cops. I was like, we just saw what happens when there's no cops around. It's a terrible
right.
idea. But this explanation to me sounds like a great idea. And again, I mean, we've got to look at all this stuff a lot more closely. But I think this is a great notion of, you know, not sending in a militarized, you know, weaponized force to do some of these social work beats. I think is a great concept. If there's a way to shift some of that funding and focus into a different universe, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and
Uh,
people forget how militarized the police became only kind of in recent years. I mean, they've been moving that direction for a long time, but 9/11 happened and people were really on a high alert for the idea of, like smaller terrorist incidents in their, smaller cities and counties. And so there's all those Homeland Security grants went out and they started giving cops all kinds of tanks and riots stuff. Like a buddy of mine, I won't say what his job is, but he works for a small town in the government. He's not a cop, and he was telling me, this was a couple of years ago. He's like, man, I was over at the police station. It's like, you would not believe the kind of hyper military equipment. It's like, they look like they could launch an assault on our Iraqi town, during the war. He's like, and it's a town of 8,000 people where nothing ever happens. But they just have, so police departments everywhere just have these guns and just all these devices that are highly militarized. Their training is getting more militarized. And then you send them under the American streets, to solve problems, and a lot of times that are not calling for that kind of response.
yeah,
So,
I would love to trade a gigantic tank situation for an army of thoughtful social workers. If that's the trade-off in how we're spending our money and resources, sign me up. That sounds way better.
yeah, and like I said, you do need the cops. Like, I'm not saying you send out somebody to gently talk down the guy shooting up the shopping mall, or
Sure.
or whatever. There's it's kind of interesting. The SWAT team was kind of a newer thing in the 80s. That was a big thing in the movies. The SWAT team was always the big deal. And I feel like they almost don't even differentiate between the cops and the SWAT team anymore. But the whole point of the SWAT team was that they were like the military and the cops were like the cops, right? Like, they were supposed to be super differentiated from the regular cops. It was like, oh, that's Officer Friendly who does the traffic patrol and who comes running if I get burglarized. And then there's the guy with the machine gun and the crazy helmet. And they were like, whoa, the SWAT team.
I know. When I was in Hollywood the other day, like, there were different pockets of areas in Hollywood that were completely shut down. There was like a 10-block radius where there was really heavy forces, and they were all different clusters of thing. There was clearly a police force, and there was clearly a soldier force, and there was some other thing that was a different uniform that was something else, but they all had similar weapons and gear and thing. It wasn't that dramatically different. Yeah, it's a good point.
And then you see, by the way, in Washington, D.C., they've got guys guarding the front of the White House in completely unmarked gear, no badges, no labels. So you don't know what agency they're with. They're unidentifiable. They're unaccountable. They all have these weapons. And it turns out, they did a report, a bunch of them turned out they're prison guards who are being called up from Texas.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you who deals with the public, great. Prison guards.
Texas prison guards.
So you got like 100 of the redheaded guy from Shawshank Redemption who threatens to throw Andy off the roof, and they're the ones who are staring down your niece who's at the protest. Like, that's a great idea.
Yeah, that's right.
Jeez.
So what do we do? Two more questions. What do we do now? What are we supposed to do? We're thoughtful white guys. But we've been told this. We're to solve this.
That counts for less than it used to, I think. For a good reason. Don't get me wrong.
Why? What is it that we're supposed to do now? I'm happy to do it. I just don't.
When you say we, you mean we as a society, or me and you?
All right. Let's get both. Let's get both answers.
Okay.
Let's have both.
As a society, I think I hope these protests really continue, and I think hopefully we're on the dawn of criminal justice reform, the way we had civil rights reform in the 60s. And the grim irony is that the criminal justice reform is basically accomplishing the same goal as civil rights reform, because we basically said, like, hey, you can't segregate people, you can't lynch people, and you got to treat people fairly. And then we figured out a way for our law enforcement to do most of that for us. And so we're gonna, have to like fundamental changes in structures to try to even some of this out and try to that's kind of been my pet issue for a long time. Is you just look at America's incarceration rates, they are astronomical. It's where classism and racism like breed the heaviest. It's the ones that have the longest echo, like, for class and race problems, where it's like people are like, well, where are all these black kids? Where are all their dads? It's like, you put them in jail for having a joint in their pocket, but you didn't put me in jail for having a joint in my pocket. That's where they are. I get to carry weed and they don't. It's ridiculous. So drug crime, but not even just along a race vector, but also in class, right? poor people stay poor in part because of that legacy, and because it's, that makes it so much harder to climb out of. Why are we throwing people in jail for these dumb drug crimes? Why are we throwing people in jail for so long for nonviolent crimes? There's a lot of stuff. America's judicial system is screwy from the moment you get into it to the moment you get out of it, as far as I can tell. And my stint on jury duty didn't do anything to make me feel any better about it. None of it. So I think criminal justice reform, at just a really fundamental level, is probably the number one societal goal that we can shoot toward. No pun intended. To do that, just continued pressure. It's voting and it's protesting. I mean, the protests are clearly having an effect, right? The cop got charged with a higher murder charge.
Yeah,
the other
right.
3 cops got arrested. The FBI announced they're launching an investigation into Breonna Taylor's killing. So like, it's having an effect. Clearly, good things are coming of it. People are talking about these reforms. So I think you can protest. You can support protesters. You can correct people. Is what you can do as a person. I have a lot of small town people I've talked to in my life, calling, checking on me. They're like, oh, well, that's just crazy what they're doing up there, and you're in danger, and I'm afraid it's going to come down here. And you're like, no, that's not coming to your small town. I hope the reform comes to your small town, but don't worry, the big scary city people are going to come march through your streets. That it is mostly peaceful protesting for a purpose, to like let people know, like, this isn't some sort of, this is for everybody and you should support this. And it's like, tell everybody in your life, kind of like defund the police. Like, if you hear somebody mention it and sneer at it, say, well, actually,
right.
just kind of do that. And like, listen to black people, I think would be, I mean, not that you're not, but
no,
listen to black people. One thing I think it's always good is just like, I would say like, just like whatever the thing that you like is, I think this is a good rule in life. If you like music, if you like movies, if you're a big serialized TV fan, whatever your thing is, make it a point to try to really like watch a wide diversity of things within that range. So if you like to read novels, read some novels by black writers. You don't even really have to step out. If you're not into music, well, you don't have to go buy a bunch of hip hop records and like force yourself to try to get into it. But like, if you like movies, watch a bunch of movies by black filmmakers. You'd be surprised what you learn. I think art is really helpful that way, where like, just like the art you already like horror movies, watch Candyman, watch Jordan Peele movies, watch horror noir, watch all these great things. And like, you'll learn stuff through that, and it won't even, it's not like homework, but you can start kind of broadening your perspective that way. And then who knows what you'll learn from that. And then you can kind of branch out from that. And, it's not the full answer, but it's something.
I like that. That's a great idea. This is a smushy parallel, but I feel like again, this is all relative, but I feel like a relatively thoughtful guy in the world, and the Me Too movement pushed me further into the conversation, and I learned a lot from talking to my wife and some female comics and other characters that I knew in the world, and I learned things that I didn't know about what it is to be a woman, and I feel like this is now, and has continued to be, but we're having a particular blip of it. We're having a big conversation about race and the way that we interact with law enforcement, and I feel like white people are waking up a little bit in a similar way to the black voice, in the way that white men did, men did to the female voice. I feel like these big cultural conversations are useful. So
definitely.
I hope we can continue to talk about this stuff and listen. And, again, it's a little bit of a bullshitty parallel, but there is a gap in the male-female experience, and there's a gap in the white-black experience. And I feel like learning what's happening on the other side of this chasm is part of the solution. So.
Absolutely. You can't hurt. And also, I don't know. I think one thing is, people get really defensive with this stuff that comes up. I think they're afraid they're going to do something wrong, or they're afraid that something that they really think is going to be wrong, and that's going to make them a bad person or whatever. Right. But like, I think, and I'm not saying I've never been guilty of this either, but just like, I don't know, it's just like, be willing to be wrong, be willing to change your mind a little bit, and don't be defensive. People aren't, I'll tell you this, the only people in the last couple of weeks that have like come at me and told me I was a horrible person, or like, I had a couple of people really tell me I was a real jerk for stuff I was saying. It's all white people. It was all white people. And there's 3 white girls. I was only white. So if some stuck-up white person trying to. That's the people who like do the virtue signal is kind of a dumb term, but in my experience, the people who kind of do judge people for sport tends to kind of come from that direction more. Who gives a shit what they think? But like listen to people around you. And comedy, by the way, is a great way to learn experiences of other people. And I think comics probably are maybe a little less surprised by a lot of things that go on in the world, including some of this, because you know when you're a comic, you work around people of all different races and ages. It's
travel
you
a
have
lot.
like you travel a lot, but it's like some comics like, oh, that's she's a single mom, she's got a couple of kids and she writes for a show and she travels around, and then this is a young black guy who's just starting off, and then this guy was an actor, and this you wind up with people. My friend group is super diverse because it's mostly I'm just friends with comics up here. That's who I work with.
Right. Yeah, that's
and
right.
and there's just a lot of different kind of people. Whereas if you work in some jobs that kind of funnel similar people. So it's like maybe if you work in IT, it's just like you and then a bunch of Indian dudes, but there's not as many black dudes around, or wherever your job is. Most people's jobs tend to people tend to fall into little bubbles, right? And then it's like, oh, it's me and a bunch of other white people who all went to private schools, or it's me and a bunch of other dudes. There's no women who work in this industry or whatever.
Right.
So I think comedy is nice in that it is like pretty diverse as a business. At least it's kind of like football, right? Like all the players are pretty diverse, and it's usually less so as you go up the ladder. Team owners don't tend to reflect the player situation nearly as much, in my experience.
Not yet. This was great, man. What a great conversation. Thanks for opening up the whole fucking front row. You can tell us the experience. It was cool to get to ask you all the questions and knock it around with you.
Yeah, I have a question for you.
All right.
We'll do it real quick, but I'm doing the first Acme show back a week. So a week from this Friday, I have my first show. I haven't been on stage in 2 months. There's a pandemic. I haven't gotten to go to an open mic to work on any new material.
Right.
My city's been torn apart by riots and police brutality. What the hell am I going to talk about for 45 minutes?
Oh my God. It's such a challenge.
There's everything to say and nothing to say. I've got the notebook out. I don't even know how to approach it.
It's weird. If I'm probably wrong, but I feel like I'm the perfect person to ask this question of, because I worked in Oklahoma City the week after the bombings there. I worked on 9/12
of 2001, presumably.
Yes.
Not 1986.
I worked the night in Atlanta at the Punchline the day of the bombing.
Whoa.
The Olympics.
Where were you at?
I've had a handful of these situations where it's you don't feel like laughing about anything. You're fucking pissed and you're hurt and you're confused, and I think it's the same rule that you would naturally fall to. The answer is to talk about it up front, and it doesn't have to be for long, but you can't not talk about it. And then you can kind of ease into whatever else you want to do. And you can even use the trick of talking about it a little bit and going, okay, we're not denying that there's some heavy shit happening. We're going to put that on a shelf for a little while and we're going to have some fun. You can kind of pull that trick too if you need to, but you won't. You'll have a great, you're smart and interesting and funny, and you can just talk a little bit about what's going on in a way. And the other trick is to joke about the periphery. Like, you can't joke about the murder.
Oh God, no.
But you just to over explain this, but you can obviously joke about the accelerants in your neighborhood, like that's another kind of comedy trick that I've learned over the years from dealing with this kind of situation.
That's kind of how I've always approached political comedy. Like, I never talk about the president because I think people will it's very frustrating. It's not because it'll divide the room. It doesn't divide the room. It makes the whole room exhausted, But you can talk about the issues that surround that and people will totally dial in. But you're right. It's about coming at it from an angle on the edge. That's really smart. That's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
It helps because your experience is fascinating. Like, you lived right near there. I mean, this is a really interesting situation. So all of that stuff and learning that now what the explosion of a car sounds like. This is fascinating.
I knew that one. Weirdly enough.
So you'll be fine. You're great at this kind of shit.
Yeah, it's gonna be because, like I said, I just want to thank you. I appreciate that. It's gonna be one of those things where you feel a little pressure because you want to represent well and you want to be thoughtful, but then you also like the job is still to be funny. And I'm certainly not going to just talk about riots for and murder and police for 45 minutes.
Right. No,
That's
of
too
course.
much.
Right.
Yeah, so kind of that balance and yeah, trying to not over like you said, not overlook something, but also like, hey, we're trying to take people's minds off things or at least let them release some tension a little bit.
Right. 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 The other thing I would recommend, just like practical comedy advice, is do the homework, like work on it a lot and tweet those jokes and rewrite those jokes and run those jokes with your wife and practice them on a buddy and just some of that stuff. Because you're going to have all the other craziness that's going to make it hard. You're going to be rusty and it's going to be a situation without a real crowd. And there's a lot of things that are going to be fucking weird about it. So you at least want to be kind of good at the joke part,
That's a great point. Yeah, there's already so many other factors taking away from the normalcy of the situation.
Right. Right. So it's like anything, like when you go do an audition that you're worried about, you're going to have the pressure of the audition. So you better be good at the other shit, because you're already going to be a little less good at some of the things. So it's the same sort of advice on that. Hey, I didn't think of this till just now. What happened with the roast battle? You guys were killing it. Did you win?
Undefeated, 8-0 champions. We would beat every dang city or everybody who beat everybody other city. We won. Yeah, undefeated.
To people who are watching, you don't know what I'm talking about. They did a roast battle where it was like an NCAA bracket of all and there were comics representing all these different cities, and you had to beat, like you guys beat whatever, Atlanta, and then you played Cincinnati, whatever that was.
Yeah.
You won 8 in a row?
Yeah, we're the only
undefeated.
The last two teams in the finals, it was us against Seattle, and Andrew Rivers and Monica Nevi from Seattle, very funny. They were 7-0 coming into the finals. And me and Nate Abshire, representing Minneapolis, were 7-0 coming into the finals. Only 2 undefeated teams in the tournament in the finals. And then a crazy thing happened, which is we wrote, so long story short, you had to write a lot of jokes in a really short amount of time. Yeah. And we'd a ton of jokes because we had to write a joke for the semifinal and the final round were the same day, and you didn't know which city you were going to go against in the finals if you made it. So you had to write jokes for all 3 cities. One you're for sure going to face, and one you might face. Oh. Right? You don't even know, and one that you'll never use. So we wrote for 12 hours between the night before and the final night. We wrote all these jokes, and one at the very end, somebody said something that gave me an idea, and I ended up adding a joke to Seattle. I had a 4th joke for Seattle. We only needed 3. I had a 4th joke. And I was like, I might use it, I might not, probably not, I don't know, whatever. And Seattle came around, and they got to go first, and I was going to go next. And the girl before me, Monica, who's very funny, she did a joke that was almost word for word exactly what I was going to do as my first joke, like with a slight perspective flip, but the construction was the same. It was a good joke. I liked my joke, I thought it was my best one. And it was an identical joke that made mine. I mean, she did it. And I just froze, and I saw Nate like, oh, we were like, oh no. And so I just like blindly grabbed for the 4th joke that I had lying around and did that. And it was okay enough to keep us in it. But it was like down to the wire on that. But man, I couldn't believe when Monica did that joke.
I love that. Good. Congratulations, man. That's cool. That's a great achievement. I love that. You got to put that in your bio. That's a cool thing.
I am going to put that. We were proud of it. I mean, there were some really funny comics in it. Katie Hughes from Atlanta and John Westling from Texas. Your guy Todd McComas from Indy and Ryan Miller. Yeah, there was a Mike Cronin, Mary Santora. I mean, the list goes on. It was a ton of great comics. So it was a lot of fun. And Nate and I basically decided that apparently we're just really mean. Because we were just like, yeah, I don't know. This seems pretty natural to us.
Other people are good joke writers. It's the perfect combination for a roast battle.
Yeah, it was really fun. So yeah, that was cool to win. That was through Helium, and I think you can still, if people are interested, I think you can still go buy like the package and watch all the roasts. And it's Mark Norman and Joe List hosted it, and they were doing 6 shows a week for 2 weeks, and then the finals after that. So there's tons of content on there. Just great roast jokes.
I actually I have Todd McComas on my short list of people to do this with because he's a former cop, and I want to talk to him about all this stuff.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, that's right. I think someone brought that up in the roast actually. And Tony Deo was in it. I saw Tony Deo in there. Talked to him a little bit.
That's right. I love those guys. All right,
Yeah.
man. So Acme, the 12th and 13th, right? Coming up here.
Yeah, June 12th and 13th. You can watch it from anywhere. If the tickets aren't limited, they limit it to two. It's kind of cool. They limit it to 290 tickets on Zoom, exactly the same seating as their max capacity in the club. So it's the exact same number of tickets.
That's cool.
Yeah, so they're doing, so that'll be 12th and 13th, and then that'll be the first one, and then after that, Acme's going to do one every week, and they're going to keep doing Zoom shows, and then they're going to keep, I think, adding nights. They're going to look into add late shows and then move back. The goal is to move toward 7 shows a week. When they let us dine in again, then they'll be half full. So they're going to have, so they'll be, you can still Zoom in to watch the show if you're more comfortable with that, or you can go in and buy a ticket. So when you watch the Zoom show, there'll be like half of an audience there, and it'll make the show better. But if you're not comfortable going out, you know, because of the pandemic or whatever, you can still stay in your house and watch the same show.
It's great.
It's a great idea.
One of the great clubs of all time. It's It's great. The club's great. The staff's great. Great talk, man.
Yeah, for sure.
Those of you watching, come back and watch us again. We'll be in this very same space. Probably going to use this month to do some more of this kind of talk. I'd love to get Todd, and if I can pull it off without looking like it's cheesy tokenism, I want to talk to a couple of Black friends about their.
Do you want to introduce you to some people?
Yeah. Touche.
Oh, you're just to start and to end. You just tossed me such a gentle softball. Right. You're a really professional host.
So we'll continue to have conversations about this kind of stuff, and we'll of course do light stuff on Wednesdays at least. We'll do in Fantasy Throwback over there. Again, check out Patreon. Just type in Costaki, and it's got the whole explanation in there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Be good to each other. Let's grow up a little as a culture and improve and continue to enjoy our crazy lives. I could probably polish that up. Thanks, Bryan. You're the best. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Bye, Bryan.
See you.